All right, everyone. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. It was certainly an interesting selection of things to choose from out there. As we said before, hopefully you didn't use up all your questions over the break. I did see a few people cornering these folks. So if you did ask a question, could you ask it again so everybody can hear the response? It would be great. And does anyone want to kick off proceedings with a question?
I'll ask the same question I asked Brendan, but you don't have to answer it. And that was around the ability of us to assess the importance of impacts on different, say, environments or species relative to others, and are there existing methods to do that, whether it's inherent importance or cultural importance or economic importance, and how, if there's any work around quantifying that, even if it's a qualitative assessment.
Yep. Yeah, I guess there is a range of techniques. If you think around valuing, say, ecosystem goods and services, we've done some work mapping those for the Hauraki Gulf. When you come down to putting a relative value on it, I think that becomes a lot harder to do if you kind of try and weigh up. But there are methods that will look at, say, economic, social, cultural value approaches, and some of that is happening within the Sustainable Seas program for marine environments. I think some of the other national science challenges are trying to sort of tackle exactly that in terms of relative values for New Zealand of different ecosystems.
Yeah, just endorsing what Megan said, and reflecting on the fact that the work we did would benefit from maybe that kind of approach, some sort of expert panel around the relative levels of risk, but I would couch that with the idea that actually how good are we at qualitative predictions. If we were to go back to 1970 and look at how we predicted where we might be now, I think we might be quite surprised. So there's no substitute for data. The scientists would say that, wouldn't they?
I was just going to add to that around the complexity as well, that, as Brendan's shown, that it's not just one ecosystem, it's then what happens to other adjacent systems or other species within that. So we can kind of make these linear projections and weigh things up, but then we don't actually understand enough to say, well, if you take that thing out, this is what's going to happen. So that kind of surprise effect is really hard to take account of.
It's probably fair to say too that climate change impacts, we've predicted them to be relatively linear, but they might not be as well. One thing that I sort of noted was largely around that squeeze effect that you talked about, particularly in urban areas where humans and vulnerable ecosystems are going to be competing for even scarcer resources. What do you think should be done there? And scarce resource, I guess, is habitats that are suitable.
Yeah, so I think that's a very topical, complex question, and it depends how much land is actually available. Like in some areas, we've modified things, so even if we remove modifications, we can't go back into those areas. So the flip side of that is to look at where we can enhance and where we can increase those ecosystems as well. So it's looking at it from two aspects, where there is going to be that coastal squeeze, and what we can do to mitigate it might be looking at opportunities to enhance areas where that squeeze is not so tight. And obviously with our coastline along the east coast there, with cliffs and intertidal reefs, there's not an awful lot we can do about that. So again, trying to address the overall stresses that are happening in those systems to reduce those impacts.
Thank you. Is there going to be a problem in trying to reach a balance between ecosystem functioning and protecting indigenous species? Is there going to be a point where we might need to make a decision that in order to have functioning ecosystems, you can't spend as much time trying to protect what's indigenous and rather use what's exotic because it's more adaptable?
Yes, I think is probably the short answer. And actually there's also conflicts within indigenous species as well, in terms of what we found with the threatened plants is that a lot of their they can be quite disturbance adapted. So, you know, some of them need fire and those types of things for their regeneration, and that then comes into conflict with, you know, other ecosystems that don't want fire. So yes, I think we're going to have to get very, what's the word? I can't think of it at the moment. Yeah, we get all the options are going to have to be on the table, but well buffered, well managed ecosystems are going to be less or more adapted to these stresses. So I don't think that's going to go out the window. Yeah, and they also tend to offer a wider range of ecosystem services and be more buffered against change.
I mean, just one point is protection of diversity, I think, is crucial. The slide I showed where we're looking back to land, the one thing we can do in the ocean is just maintain diversity, because that's what we're really going to need is in our bank balance to really cope, as I see it.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed from your talks is that you're essentially accepting that the anthropogenic change, even if we stop emitting, is going to carry on through the environment, particularly in ocean acidification. There's so much up there already that even if we started, you know, being net carbon sinks, it's going to exist for a long time. So all of you mentioned restoration and enhancement, and where should those actions be focused? Probably in the buffer zones, I guess, based on your earlier responses, but did you want to discuss that?
Yeah, so I guess that comes back to Craig's point around maintaining intact ecosystems, and where we've modified some of those significantly, then looking for options to restore those in other areas. It's not around a particular ecosystem or area that we need to be restoring, but it's thinking around maintaining that diversity of habitats and species. And so where we have got that opportunity, you know, that offers a range of benefits for us, not just around climate, but around the other ecosystem services they provide. I guess there's, you know, our coastal ecosystems obviously are under a huge amount of land-based stress, as well as the squeeze coming in from the climate or sea level rise. So, you know, that's an area of focus that we do know something about in terms of being able to do things in those areas. But there's also a huge area of research in terms of what we can do out in the oceans around restoration as well. And I think we're at the beginning of that, and we need to continue that, but the climate change effects will have an effect on that as well. So the more we can do to protect and reduce the need for that restoration, the better.
Yeah, and at least in terms of terrestrial ecosystems, I guess one of the positives, there aren't many, is that we are getting better at restoring. You know, there's a lot going on at the moment, and we're learning all the time. So particularly recreating forest and scrub ecosystems, you know, one of the problems is with this fragmented landscape, the ability of plants and animals to move through it. So, you know, we can concentrate on linking up well-buffered ecosystems would be a good way of adapting to that. The trick is to get the land to do it.
Which is possibly the scarcest resource of all. We've got population growth, life by New Zealand type scenarios and that kind of thing as well. Does anyone else have more questions? Thank you.
Yeah, just a question around marine pests and what work's being done and what's our understanding, especially fanworm and these other ones that we know about, and there's probably loads more.
If you soak fanworm for 180 minutes in fresh water, it's dead. That's what we know. But it's going to be incredibly difficult to control. If you take a worm and cut it into 10 pieces, each of those pieces will turn into a new worm. So as I find with many marine pests, it's about prevention of them actually getting here, because once they're established, it becomes very, very hard to get rid of them, and it's a matter of adapting to them being here.
Do you know much about what climate might bring, though?
Oh, what climate?
Yeah, so the climate changes impacts on proliferation of marine pests.
Well,
Okay. So do you mean in terms of stresses, like so warming and acidification? So that's kind of like that winner and loser situation where in a lot of cases the winner will be something that can adapt very quickly and can move into an environment and proliferate it very fast. And unfortunately, that tends to be exotic pest species. And so they will tend to be winners in this scenario. I know in terms of Sibella, the fanworm, there's been a lot of research in trying to actually understand the ecophysiology and reproductive biology of the fanworms to try and assist and try and create an environment that they are no longer wanting to settle on, or like a biofilm or something. I know that's happening at Auckland University for that. But yeah, in terms of climate change, a lot of the endemic species or native species are adapted to very constrained or very specific thermal tolerance and pH tolerance, and a few of them will have short generation times like the kinna. And as we go forward, and as overall politicians in regards to the UN binding agreements and other heads of state, we're moving very, very fast in the wrong direction. So I think there we're going to see a bit of proliferation in that area, and I think Auckland Council is putting more effort into.
I was just going to add really quickly to that. So yes, the MPI have done predictions around, what sort of species might arrive. But the other thing to consider is the intact ecosystems that are here. So the level of disturbance and the ability for species when they arrive to take hold will be related to how well we've looked after the ecosystems that are here in the first place.
On that note, I think we'll call it quits for that. And if we could thank our speakers in the traditional way, haumai te pakipaki. And especially thank you to Dr. Brendan Dunphy from the University of Auckland. Thank you. If we could get the speakers for the next theme up to the front, please. That's Dr. Kristen Zimmer. Here he comes. Nancy. You're not there. And Belinda, thank you. I think you're up first, boss. Yep. Yeah. So just in the traditional way, you can see your next slide and the notes are down here. You've used it before? Great. No problem.
All right. Okay. So thank you for the invitation. My name is Christian Zamit. I'm from Niwa. And with Daniel Collins, we have been charged to look as part of the Deep South of the first assessment of potential climate change impact on water resource across New Zealand. And that's looking at flooding, hydropower generation, drought, and change in the average. I'm a scientist, so I'm going to talk like a scientist, and I'm sorry for the policy people. But what I'm going to talk about is at the end of a huge modeling chain. When I say huge, I mean huge. That's better? Okay. So on one side, you have the IPCC, which is based on the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, provide representation concentration pathway, which, by the way, is only one of the three facets of climate change. And we're not even talking about the other two, which are put into a suite of global climate model, which are then used as boundary condition for regional climate model, which are giving you the change in sea surface temperature, which are then put into hydrological model, and we talk about hydrological impact. So we're just here. Based on the work that we've done so far, we've done work only looking at flow and soil moisture across New Zealand from the period 1972 to 2099, 6 RCM 4 RCPs. You are going to understand in 5 seconds why I'm hammering about this. I have a reason. So Petra and our team collected all the information that was available at the time to look at what would be the potential climate change impact for the Auckland region across a number of indicators. In terms of the hydrology, you can see that river flow are going to decrease, and the decrease is going to get higher with the emission scenario. Ecological flows are going to decrease. It's going to get drier in the soil. Drought are going to increase, and the timing of the drought and the low river flow are going to happen earlier than what we are currently experiencing. But this is based only on a comparison of 2 time slices, mid-century and end of century. And we are in a highly non-linear scenario type. You can't infer what's going to happen between 2 time slices, assuming it's going to be linear projection. It could be linear, it could be up, down, and up. It could be all over the show. And there is 2 questions that I think need to be, well, every time we are producing those assessments, there is 2 questions which are already sent back to us. It's how certain are you about the number that you are producing? And when is climate change is going to start to be noticeable, because we know that the climate is highly variable in New Zealand. So what I'm going to talk about now is about those 2 questions, and that's looking at something which has not been reported by Petra, and that's a project which we are doing in collaboration between Deep South and MPI, which is looking at irrigation water demand. But I hope it's going to illustrate what I'm intending to do, or intending to show. The first one is looking at certainty or significance. As a scientific, I like to be certain that the thing that I'm showing you is certain. So I tend to go to the 95th percentile of confidence. And here you have a map showing the irrigation water demand across New Zealand, across the 4 RCPs, and the mid-century and low century. Everything which is in gray is change are not statistically significant. So you can see that there is not a lot of area where we're sure that something is going to happen. The other thing that you are looking at is here we are reporting the change in terms of demand. And if you zoom to the Auckland region, it's quite a large change. So in terms of percentage change, which is the information that we are providing you, the change could be quite large. However, are those differences that we are showing important? If we give you a 50% of change, are we talking about 50% about a 10 megaliter a year, or 50% about a liter per second? It's not going to have the same effect for you. So now taking the same information, looking at it in terms of volume, and you have a total different picture. So what is the practical significance that you, as downstream user of this information, want to have? Are you talking about change in terms of percentage, or are you talking change in terms of volume, change in timing, or you can imagine everything going in between? So for the Auckland region, you go to something where potentially you have some change which are quite large, to change which are significant, which are in terms of volume, perhaps not that important for that characteristics. Did I lose everyone? Good. Let's go to the next one. Timing. We all know that there is a lag effect between the change in climate, the change in the hydrological cycle, and the impacts that you will see across a number of factors. The most obvious is the sea level rise. we already committed to 1 meter of sea level rise. Whatever we are doing, Tokyo, Paris, whatever, or we kill all the human and we stop emitting anything, there is still going to be 1 meter of sea level rise. If you look at the most catastrophic event, which is a total collapse of the ice sheet in Antarctica, you're looking at 16 meters. Scary, isn't it? But let's not talk about this. Why talking about things which are scary? However, with limited resource as policy maker and people which are deciding what's going to happen, you need to know when you need to intervene. And this is called the time of emergence. So when in time the climate change is going to be detectable over the natural variability. By the way, when you detected it, it's too late. You can't do anything. So act now. If we look at the same characteristic, and we look at the time of emergence in a 20-year time slice, so everything which is in blue, you're decreasing. Everything which is in red to yellow, you're increasing. So that's just the direction of the change. And the different color shade correspond that when these signals start to be detectable above the climate variability. And you can see that for the Auckland region, where it's happening quite soon, we're nearly already too late. Once you detect, you can't go back, or it's going to be really difficult. So, key message, things are going to change. It's not new. In terms of significance, everyone is going to have to agree of what significance you are talking about. Are you talking about statistical significance, and you want to make sure that you have all the ducks aligned in order that you can make a decision? Or are you talking about practical significance? And at this time, you need to relax those different assumptions. The significance of the change might need to be relaxed in terms of the indicator that you are looking and for what purpose you are going to use. We know how to deal and how to adapt under uncertainty. Humans have been doing it for the past 2,000 years. There is nothing new. We know how to do it. We don't know how to put it into an equation, but we know how to do it. We're doing it every day when we're taking our car, or we're taking the bus, or whatsoever. And most of the change which are going to happen are going to be different from climate variability by 2040. So we are going to measure them. We are going to start to measure them in 2 years' time. It's getting to a point where it might be too late to try to restore things that we know. The world in front of us is going to be different from the world we lived in. And on those notes, let's go and talk about flooding.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmer. I'm sure everybody has plenty of questions on that one, but if we could save them till the end, that'd be great. Nancy, thanks.
See if I can work the mic this time. Hello, is that? I'm done. Okay, we'll try to get through this one. So I'm going to give you 2 talks back to back on 3 reports in the CCRA series. So first I will fly through the flooding report that we're still compiling with my co-authors Jen and Kyle, actually. And then after that, is it on? It's okay? And then after that, I'll move into the work that we've been doing on compiling sea level rise inventories at both regional and local scales. And I will fly through them because I appreciate that we're kind of short on time this morning. So as is readily recognizable, flooding is the most common natural hazard in the Auckland region. And Auckland obviously has a strong relationship with water. It is a bi-coastal city with small water courses that transact the region, and made up a lot of small urban catchments that actually increase the risk of flash floods. And with our increasing population and urban growth mixed with climate change, we have the increasing combination of causes and impacts, as well as intensity and complexity of flood events. So we're back to my little risk flower, or the Triad. And in this report, we actually are trying to tackle risk as a whole. So that combination of risk equals hazard plus exposure plus vulnerability. And so with, excuse me, there's a small edit on this slide, but we I think I did that after I sent it in. So my words will be different than exactly what's on the slide. So of course, climate and the climate impacts are themselves rainfall, increasing intensity and frequency. And the hazard that thus occurs is the flooding that happens on the ground. So we do have hazard maps of floodplains, overland flow paths, and flood prone areas. And so that's the first part of things that we do know. And then after that, we'll look at exposure. So it doesn't really matter in terms of risk if there's a hazard, if it doesn't affect you in any way. So the second thing you do want to look at is exposure, and we're doing that in terms of building and population. And then again, you can ask the question, well, you can have a hazard and you can be exposed to it, but if it's not something you particularly value, or if you can handle it, if you're not all that sensitive or you have high adaptive capacity, you're not all that vulnerable, perhaps it doesn't relate into risk. So we're trying to bring that vulnerability component in order to understand the three things together and how they add up to flooding risk. So in the first place, we have hazard. We have projected rainfall changes. We've been through them a number of times this morning, and perhaps I won't dig into them that much, but suffice it to say that it is projected that we will have changing rainfall patterns with increasing heavy rain days and more consecutive days with over 40 millimeters of rainfall. In addition, the seasonality of rain will likely shift with drier autumns, spring rainfall projected to decline and autumn rainfall projected to increase. So right now, Auckland Council does have a series of flood hazard maps, as I just mentioned, and they do factor in a component of climate change by factoring in both sea level rise and a higher volume of rainfall that might be associated with 2 degrees of warming. So we've looked at what does that matter to buildings across the region. And so for the newer buildings data sets that have come in, we can assess the entire region for where buildings are in each of those flood hazard types. And so that's what this very simple graph shows. And essentially, 12% of Auckland's buildings of 10 meters squared or larger, that's how we define a building. It has to be at least 10 square meters. 12% sit in floodplains or partially overlap them. We're not talking about everything's directly in a floodplain, but if it at least partially overlaps, it's counted. 4% are in flood-prone areas, 13% in overland flow paths, and then almost a quarter, 22% are in any one of those three, and 1% actually are co-located with all of those at the same time. And then in addition, about 1% of buildings are in a coastal inundation zone of a 1 in 100-year storm, or 2% of buildings with 1 in 100-year storm that is also accompanied by 1 meter sea level rise. So the interesting thing is we also have within the urban core and the urban periphery, so just kind of the central part of Auckland, but not including the northern rural areas and the southern rural areas, we can do a change detection because we have a set of buildings from 2013 and a set from 2017. And the figures are largely the same as the regional ones. It's 11% in floodplains, and otherwise it's pretty much the same, and they don't change for the 2017 buildings. So what it means proportionally with all the growth in the region, so addition of buildings but also removal of buildings, our proportions in those flood hazard areas are still the same. So people can reflect on that and start taking that in new directions and thinking about what that means for how we're growing. The second component of exposure that we are going to look at and have started to look at is how the population might be affected. So this map created by Kyle looks at the essentially trying to assign population to affected area, and it's essentially by the proportion of a mesh block that is within one of those floodplain areas, and then distributing the population to that, assuming that the population is evenly distributed throughout each mesh block. And then we can build, that's the smallest unit that we can use, and so we can build up from there to look at any particular census area unit or any variation thereof, or creating regional statistics themselves. And then taking those two components, we have to add the third of vulnerability. And as you'll appreciate, different components of the population are affected by flooding differently. And the socio-demographic groupings that are largely important are the elderly or the mentally and physically disabled who have a hard time responding within an event. The families with young children can be very affected during events, but also very much in the recovery phase, because especially if you're a single parent household, you may be dealing with a lot of the after effects of the event, but also doing it all on your own. And that's one interesting thing that's come out of this research so far, is that the timing of the flood events is very much part of the vulnerability makeup. It's not just who the person or the community and what their characteristics are, but it's also what phase of the event they're dealing with. And different people are affected in different phases of a flood event. So some people are very particularly affected during a flood event themselves, especially if they're not able to evacuate or they have nowhere to go, whereas other people may be much more affected in the recovery phase when they really don't have the resources, whether physically or just social cohesion-wise, social community, to deal and recover with everything that happened during a flood. And these things have been studied all over the world as we're having more and more major flood effects. So in a sense, the globe is kind of a living laboratory where we can learn from other episodes and kind of know what may be coming should we ever get hit with a very massive and widespread event. And for instance, in Hurricane Katrina, 71% of the 1,800 fatalities were people aged over 60, and 47% of the fatalities were aged over 75. And most of those people were living independently with disabilities, and so a large part of the issue is that they just couldn't leave during the event. So it's all those kind of things that we need to start understanding. And much like the work that Jennifer did in the Heat Vulnerability Index, is that we can try to start building a flooding vulnerability index to also understand what the spatial part of that equation might be. So we will continue to bring all those three components together in terms of trying to understand risk. And of course, up until relatively recently, the main mitigation strategy for flood impact was through flood defense, so just the idea of prevention. But it is well recognized now that response and recovery, or that resilience, is very much part of where we need to go. And a lot of that has to do with recognizing ecosystem services, and so how we need to use our landscapes in order to deal with the hazard in the first place, but also that social infrastructure is very important, and that's been a very major factor in how other communities have been able to respond and recover from floods after they've been hit by big events. So, so that's the flying tour of the flooding report, and now I'm going to move on to sea level rise. On behalf of my co-authors, who are Kyle and Jamie and Chad. So our approach to sea level rise is actually quite simple and not where we are at with the flooding risk. And it's this is just to highlight that as a point of entry for Auckland, what we've been working on is just compiling quite simply a data inventory of sea level rise and how it might affect several sectors across the region. So we don't really have a resource where people can use it just as a place to start thinking about what may be exposed and what do we need to take into account for whatever question we're asking. So Craig was talking earlier today where they did take into account sea level rise to start looking at ecosystems and what does that mean across the board for all ecosystems, but also in particularly for those that are quite fragmented or there may be only small representations of it. But of course it applies across all sectors in Auckland or in New Zealand. So just first a word about sea level rise. Most people in the room will be quite aware, I think, but because of interesting conversations that happen along the way, and sometimes people aren't quite clear, I'll just quickly remind us all that there's three buckets essentially of water where sea level rise can originate from. The first is that water expands when the temperature increases. So water in the sea does expand with temperature increase. The second source is the retreat of mountain glaciers. So if you have water on land, but it then melts and flows into the oceans, you have now added water to the oceans. And likewise, polar ice sheets would contribute a new source of water to the oceans once they have melted because they're on land. So if you have a ice sheet that's already in the ocean, that doesn't count, but if polar ice sheets are actually quite important. The first two are well known. The third is very complex. The first two are understood to have contributed quite a lot to the sea level rise that's already occurred, and the third seems to be ramping up. So this is back to the picture from earlier in my intro, and this shows the Thwaites glacier, which NASA discovered in February, and it's being melted from below by warm ocean waters. They used ice-penetrating radar and satellites to monitor both poles and discovered that there was a cavity 2/3 the size of Manhattan and 300 meters tall at the bottom of this glacier. And so what's happening is that hole is being eaten away by warm ocean water. And so it's the size of Florida or the UK, and it's responsible for 4% of global sea level rise. It holds enough ice to raise the world's oceans a little over 65 centimeters. But more importantly, it backstops, sorry, one second. It backstops ice sheets, glaciers that would raise the sea level as an additional 2.4 meters. So not only would we be losing this glaciers, but the acceleration of melt could happen once it's gone. The cavity itself once held 14 billion tons of ice, but in 3 years it has melted and flowed into the Southern Ocean. So that's just for context when we're talking about sea level rise. We do have our projections, but we also, it's a moving landscape, essentially. No pun intended. So as you're aware, Auckland's global sea level has been estimated to have increased to about 20 centimeters during the last century. It's projected to increase 30 centimeters by the middle of this century, 50 centimeters by 2060, and a meter by the end of the century. So as we've just heard from Christian, it's locked in to 1 meter, and it's something we need to normalize, essentially, or just be really clear that it is something we're facing. So we decided that we just needed a resource, a data inventory, so we could, instead of knowing it's an issue and knowing that we need to do something about it, just needing to start quantifying what that means for Auckland. So, and without knowing, you can create a lot of scenarios for yourself. Perhaps it doesn't really matter, which is hard to imagine given that we're a bi-coastal city and we have 3,200 kilometers of coastline. Or the other scenario you could create for yourself is the isthmus going to be cut off and we're going to be 2 islands. And of course, neither one of those things is true. So we've taken 2 approaches with 2 existing set of models. Both are, well, one's a model, one's a proxy. The first thing we looked at was trying to capture what that background change of sea level rise would be. So just the idea that sea level rise is occurring, and so we will have a changing coastline, and that's that chronic or long-term background change to environmental conditions. So it's a very simple proxy based on land elevation, and we used a set of 5 bands to look at pretty much the time frames that we've been talking about all morning. So 25 centimeters, which corresponds to that first time period of around 2040, 50 centimeters, which is a little later than our 2040 time period. So 50 centimeters is slated to happen around 2060 or 2075, according to our business as usual, our CP 8.5 scenario. And then we looked at 1 meter for the end of the century. And then because we have them and because we also need long-term line of sight, we looked at 2 meters, which is slated to occur mid-next century to the end of the next century, and 3 meters. 3 meters not because we're saying it's going to happen anytime soon, but because the data is there and gives us an outer envelope to look at it, and because it can also be understood in terms of what big storms would be, but also we have this possibility of acceleration. And truly, since the 70s, we keep making our projections. You said that before, Craig. We make projections and things keep changing. And our climate change projections have repeatedly accelerated. So it's just to give basically from a lower to an upper band of what's in the envelope and what do we need to be aware of. But each band corresponds with timeframes that can be taken account of when you're looking at the data that goes with any one of them. So I can answer questions about that later if I just confused you all. The second set of models is the set of coastal inundation models that Auckland Council has, NIWA developed for Auckland Council and is on the GeoMaps website. So it's public data. We use the ARI 100 storm. That means the 1 in 100-year storm, and that's a present day storm. And then to account for climate change, the two models that go along with it, which would be the ARI 100 storm with 1 meter sea level rise or with 2 meter sea level rise. And essentially, we just cranked through data. So we'll have a data inventory that will be available to anyone to just understand how much of Auckland's territory is affected by sea level rise. And so what we can tell you at this point is this century is the yellow bands on the left picture account for 1.5% to 2.5% of Auckland region's land area. And the population estimate is about 3% of people for the method that we use to look at how do you count how many people would be affected. We've also looked at land cover through a couple different existing data sets, including land cover database that people will know about. It's our only comprehensive national inventory of land cover, but also using the current ecosystems layer that Craig talked about earlier because it gives us kind of a more fine scale look. And so there's just some summary statistics in this inventory, but of course Craig's gone through it in a lot more detail in his report. And we also looked at soils. Soils is a really big issue for all of us, and Auckland Council has made efforts to try to start protecting high quality soils given the pressures from urban growth. And the thing that pops out from the sea level rise inventory, that some of the best soils are disproportionately affected by sea level rise from the scenarios that we looked at. So not only are some of those soils under pressure from urban growth, but we have to start factoring in the fact that we have these other environmental pressures too, and that climate change is also going to be literally eating away at those soils. We also have statistics in there for buildings, the same buildings that I just talked about in the last talk, as well as community facilities and coastal assets. It will come as a great shock to you all that a lot of stuff that's along the coast is in an exposure zone for sea level rise. It's a crazy shock finding. The inventory itself is only potential exposure. So in my triad of risk, we're not talking about risk in this inventory. We're not even talking about vulnerability. The only thing it is intersection of what may occur with the understanding we currently have of sea level rise, which comes to these two models, and what's sitting along the coast. And so, as I often say, and someone begged me to say today, so I will, is that we know something's happening. The phenomenon is currently happening, is also coming, and stuff is in the way. So we just need to have the quantum of it so we can start thinking about it. And so that's the regional one, which gives you just kind of a summary stats and awareness of what the magnitude of things we're working with is. And then the second phase of it is to do a second report that Jamie's leading, and is to try to understand that at more of a local level. And that goes along with the Ministry for the Environment's guidelines. Basically, step 2 to do hazard and sea level rise assessments. This is will be a very involved process where you first need to know what's in the way, what do you have, what's the quantity. But it's in a very involved and complex process to also go out to communities, work with organizations, because it's not just an objective thing. You can't just count what's there. It's actually quite a normative process. You have to decide, how do you look at communities? What is local? What do we care about? What do we value? What do we need to account for? And so this is just a very, very first step of just trying to say it doesn't do us much good to understand that 1.5% to 2.5% of land is in a sea level rise zone. It matters when you focus down, because we all know that's the level, that's the scale that the sea level rise will be affecting people. And so just briefly to let you know, We've made an effort to look at the coast and create coastal units. There's 155 of them from where you can start summarizing what those same things that we looked at in the regional inventory are, but at a focused in level. And there's also big questions. What happens is you just start looking at the data and then people start asking a million questions, which is exactly what we want to happen, because many, many things need to come out of this work. And what it should do is promote more research and action and planning and thinking. And so none of it has all the answers. It's just, again, a place to start. And it's a normative and value process too, because there is no one right answer. And so if you want to understand what's affected or what's exposed, you have to think about, well, what do I care about? So do I care about the most buildings? Okay, count them. Where are they? Or do I care about where the rarest ecosystems are? Okay, find those places and identify those as your areas of focus. And it matters how you look at them. If you look at the counts, that's going to give you different identified areas than if you look at the proportions. So we've started running this. We're not going to talk about it in detail today, but if you look at the proportions of things that are affected, you'll end up you start finding or identifying yourself a lot of outlying rural areas, which shouldn't really come as any surprise either, because you have a lot of rural coastal communities. So it can result in the fact that most of those things are affected, even if there's only 8 things. And then the flip side of that is we have high dense areas where it might not be the highest proportion area, but it might be the densest proportion. So the most buildings in a particular area. So there's just a lot of work there to do. Both we are undertaking some of it, but I think it's probably just a really massive topic and thing that will affect many people and organizations across the region. It's no one answer for anybody, but also no one answer will come out of any one organization either. And I'm just going to leave it there for now.
Thank you, Nancy. If I can ask Belinda.
Okay, sure. So I work in probabilities, that's my day job, and I anticipated being the last speaker before lunch that I may be squeezed for time, so I've kept my presentation pretty short. What I'm going to be talking about today is the concept of insurance retreat. You may have seen some of the news articles that have been coming out of Wellington. That is to do with seismic risk, not to do with climate change, but there are definitely implications. So what I want to talk about... No? Okay. Is give you a bit of an introduction to how climate change distributions are changing and how that's likely to impact on insurance. So what we have here is a normal standard distribution. Many climate phenomena do follow this, some don't. But for the purposes of today, I'll talk about a normal standard distribution. And if you see from the in the subtitle, as far as climate change is concerned, scientists are most confident about predicting how temperature distributions are going to change. They have a good understanding about sea level rise if you exclude the collapse of the ice sheets. Precipitation is more difficult to predict, and storm surges are next to impossible from a climate change perspective. And that's simply because of the size of the tropical cyclones relative to the resolution of the climate models. So if you think about insurance, insurance only insures rare events. Events that occur on a regular basis, you wouldn't insure for. You either wouldn't be there, you wouldn't build your house on sand, or you make your house sufficiently robust to be able to withstand that amount of rainfall. So insurance is designed to insure the rare events. So if you look down here, this is taking a probability of a 1 in 50 year event, or an AEP of 2%. And in this example, you're at 2 standard deviations from the mean. So that's what insurance is covering. Now that's not necessarily, this may be where a lot of the houses are, or houses are out of the way. So you're not going to actually have houses built on sand, it's just going to be in the middle. When you have a shift in the distribution, the average when the average shifts, so this is a new distribution, the new average isn't all that different to the old average because you would have experienced it, say, once every 6 years. But there's a significant change in the mean, in the extremes. So what happens there is you get this massive increase in the probability of an event that was previously insurable. So when I first started looking at the impact of sea level rise on property values, I took the initial approach, which was the bathtub approach, of seeing where sea level rise is going to be in, say, 2100. But when I started modelling the impact of that, what I found is there are a number of triggers that happen well before then that have a significant impact on the property value. And insurance retreat is likely to be the first one. So when that happens, insurers aren't going to want to maintain that very high probability. They're going to move with the curve. So they will retain the probability of insurable events. And everyone who was previously in this area here is likely to lose insurance. So the question is, what is that threshold? The other thing about climate change is it's not just shifting the curve, it's changing the shape of the curve, which means you get even further of a shift in retreat. So if you think about how, when I started looking at this a couple of years ago, the idea of insurance retreat was certainly something that was discussed internationally. It happened in Florida following Hurricane Andrew in the early 1990s, but it wasn't something that was top of mind in the New Zealand conversation. There was this is the Edgecombe flood defence failure. Whether that was caused by climate change or not, that is something that some scientist friends of mine are going to be looking at another point. But what struck me about this was there was a news report about a person who rang Radio New Zealand to say that his insurance premiums had increased from about $1,500 to $5,000. And he commented, as a pensioner, that's $100 a week in insurance premiums. I can't afford that. His insurer was Tower Insurance, and Tower Insurance said, oh, I'm so terribly sorry, it's been a mistake, and he had an adjustment. But as you've probably heard, most in particular in the last couple of weeks, that conversation about insurance retreat has increased significantly. Insurers are now starting to talk about the fact that there will be some locations that they're unable to insure. It started most strongly in the terms of earthquake risk following Kaikoura, but they are also starting to make those assessments as far as climate change is concerned. So in last year, the same insurance company made a decision to lift insurance premiums in Wellington because of seismic risk, and reduce insurance premiums in Auckland. I don't know if anyone's noticed that yet on their insurance premiums, but there's a very small percentage of people who have very big increases, and then a very large number of people who get very small decreases. And then just in the last couple of weeks, IAG have found that when Tower lifted those insurance premiums, people started to shop around. They weren't comfortable with the risk adjustment that they were getting. So they've then switched to looking for other insurers. IAG has been approached by a number of those people asking to switch, and IAG had made a decision that they were going to stick with existing customers rather than stick with the location. So what you're starting to find in Wellington is that there are people who are wanting to sign up to IAG, and IAG are looking at them on a case-by-case basis. But they will be making very tough decisions about what risk they're wanting to absorb. The danger with insurance is that you can get a race to the bottom, and that if an insurer lifts their insurance premiums, people leave them. They then go to someone else to look for that price. And one thing that's particularly concerning is who is going to be available to provide that insurance. Is it the big players, or is it smaller players who are coming in, and do they have the appropriate level of capital to withstand a very large event? Now, the decisions that were made by IAG in Wellington was about a concentration of risk. A very big event hitting in Wellington and potentially wiping out the company's capital within New Zealand, which is what happened to AMI in Christchurch. In climate change, it's more about an escalation of risk than a concentration of risk. It's that the fact that the risk is changing quite quickly, and you can have a location that is assessed each year whether it will continue to have insurance. So people have a presumption that if they pay their insurance premiums and they don't engage in insurance fraud, that they will continue to receive insurance in that location. But the risk may be changing, and insurers assess that every 12 months. So you actually only have insurance for 12 months. Now that's very difficult from a city basis. How do you make decisions about planning for the next 100 years if there are certain locations that only have insurance at the moment and could lose it in the next 5 years, could lose it in the next 20 years? So part of the research I'm looking at is wanting to get a feel of what those thresholds are. It's very difficult to get information on this because it's privately held information within private insurers, and even EQC doesn't have the information about where people are covered. But what we can see is that at 1 in 20 year, so about a 5% probability, you're very unlikely to still have insurance. But what we find is that even as you approach this, so say you're at a 1% AEP, and you approach 2% annual exceedance probability, you may have what I would call partial retreat. So you could have $10,000 excesses put on your property. So if you think about the example of the pensioner who his increase in insurance premiums went from $1,500 to $5,000, and he had a $10,000 excess on flood damage added to his policy. This is from an actuarial perspective where we would expect to see retreat, but interestingly, in the UK, private insurers have pulled out of providing flood cover in the UK at a much earlier probability. So only the difference between a 1 in 100 to a 1 in 75, an increase of risk from 1% per year to 1.3. So to look at this is an example in Sydney, and this wasn't a particularly large storm. You'll see that they had rock armoury in place. It wasn't a particularly large storm, but it came from a different direction. So sometimes it may not be the size of the storm, it may be that there's a change in the patterns in that particular location. Obviously these houses are going to be struggling, are unlikely to be having insurance, but the question is, at what point do you expect to see other locations find it difficult to lose insurance? So that's the research, and I don't have answers for you today. But as part of the Deep South National Science Challenge, we're looking at all of the locations that have high resolution LiDAR data to get an estimate of when and where we expect to see insurance retreat. Now, if you think about Nancy's slide earlier, I'm looking, the sea level rise projections are given out into for the first 30 centimetres. That doesn't matter what RCP scenario you're looking at. That's a given. So in focusing on this, when I'm thinking about decisions that investors are making or homeowners are making, I'm focusing very much on the near-term horizons. So looking at the next 20 years, maybe the next 40 years. Because if you can give people that greater understanding about what is very likely to occur, even if it's a smaller change than what could occur at the end of the century, that seems to be what people resonate with. Now the other thing to bear in mind is this is just sea level. You remember at the very beginning I talked about storm surges being next to impossible to predict. So part of what I do is I bug the scientists and say, but we want this information. And so we are also putting in for a grant to look at how those extreme events are changing, not just with sea level rise, but actual modelling of extreme event changes. And so when we have that information, we'll be able to have a better understanding, not only of what is happening with coastal property, but also what is happening with infrastructure exposed to extreme precipitation, and any hazard where it is escalating rapidly under climate change.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. We'll open up the floor for further questions. I have one right here.
Thanks, everyone. Just a quick question, Belinda. I'm not sure whether you can answer this, but everyone that's spoken so far has used different scales of analysis in terms of some census area units, some asset data, et cetera, to tell their story about where things are at. Just in terms of the insurance industry, like what's their kind of capability in terms of what sort of data sets do they have access to, and how do they go about and what scales do they work at? Do you know?
So in some cases, they are able to get information that is house by house. There's far better information from a seismic perspective than there is from a climate change perspective, and that's partly because the science doesn't exist yet. So I would argue that the insurance industry is probably 20 years ahead of the rest of the private sector in terms of climate change modelling, but they're not keeping up with how fast things are changing. The banking industry is much later to the party, even just the last couple of years.
A question at the back. Sorry, this may seem like a naive question to some of the more technical folks in the room, but I was curious specifically how you define sea level rise, and strangely I've never really seen this spelled out. So when you say sea level rise, the coast moves in, say, 1 meter over the course of a certain period of time, or like the volume of water actually goes up like 1 meter, so we're like standing 1 meter deep in water in that area more so than before?
It's vertical.
It's vertical,
yep.
Okay.
Oh, hi. There's obviously a lot of work going on in the flooding inundation area. I just wondered if there's research going on cliff erosion, like the kind of other side of sea level rise impacts on the coast. There's definitely a very significant change in risk for those locations, but it effectively requires on-the-ground assessment. So we're not able to do that at a national scale at this point. So there's no, as far as I'm aware, there isn't any national scale view of that. But there will be individual homeowners who will be looking at that, and that may be information that insurers start to require.
Also, not in REMU, but in another part of council, there is a coastal erosion study underway that will be out later in the year, I believe.
Oh, I had a question too, and it links Christian's and Belinda's ones together. You mentioned policy thresholds, I guess, as a indication of significance, and I think Belinda's one really picks up on where that threshold is in terms of the ability for people to receive insurance, and therefore the property values or the value that people are able to purchase a property for, get lending for, and that kind of thing. Do you expect that to essentially accelerate or be in advance of, I guess, council's willingness to regulate that kind of thing? And what's the relationship between people requiring consent to build in areas that we've identified with hazards, being informed through that process? They have to apply, and where the responsibility or the moral hazard that would arise from people building in places that are subject to risk when they can't get insurance. Should everybody else pay for that, I guess?
That seems like a lot of questions in there,
yeah.
but
Sorry, I broke my own.
so what I would start is that when I first started looking at this, I looked at it from a policy planning perspective. And frankly, I looked at all the international literature and saw lots and lots of policy makers hitting their heads against the bricks wall because there is such fierce resistance to proactive decision making in this space. Now that was just a few years ago, so that's all around the world, everywhere that is facing this issue. So part of it is I looked at it and thought, well, if policymakers are having such difficult time responding to this, what happens in the absence of that action?
and I looked at it and thought, the market will respond. So that's partly why I started looking at property prices. The good news is that property prices respond fairly slowly. So it's not likely that there's going to be a crash caused by any major single event in New Zealand from a weather perspective. You're far more likely to get a change in property prices from a change in interest rates or availability of credit that comes from international finance. So in that sense, that's an element of reassurance. As far as the moral hazard is concerned, that is a critical problem that I think needs to be addressed. There's a specific term they talk about, charity hazard, and that when there's a major event, it is extremely difficult for policymakers to say, well, actually, we're not going to bail this particular location out. And again, that's represented worldwide. So I think that as far as planning is concerned, the better information we provide, allowing local government with the instruction to provide that information, so removing the current legal jeopardy that they're facing about whether they provide that information or not, so that all potential homeowners have the information, I think is a critical piece. But there's also a chance that there's information we just don't know. The science isn't there yet. And so there is an element of how can we hold someone accountable when even we don't necessarily know what that risk is. Because there will be locations that, for example, are in a 1 in a 500 year zone that may become exposed and may lose insurance. So there will be people who say, well, hang on, I thought I was safe.
Were there any further questions? One at the back.
You had mentioned that the insurance industry is, maybe 10 or 20 years ahead of any other industries, and perhaps even many of the, say, urban planners and government organizations. I was just wondering, you said that they're getting quite advanced with their modeling. In what ways are they sort of getting so far ahead of the curve so fast? Like, what are they building internal capabilities? Is there some kind of software tool that they're using?
It's more an indication that how far behind the rest of the private sector is. So they don't have projections that are 20 years out. It's just that they've been thinking about this for 20 years. And the other thing is insurers don't have to think 20 years out. They only need to think out 12 months, maybe 3 years. So in a sense, there's no incentive for them to do long-term projections, but there absolutely is a need for that if you're wanting to plan for a city. They have internal capability because they've been thinking about it for 20 years. But
the other thing is they basically mine climate and hydrologists all over the world. They are taking them on board. They're offering them quite a big salary, to be totally honest, and they go and work with them. And because they are a worldwide company, they have access to a lot of information that as a country like New Zealand level, we're not going to have access. We're doing quite a bit of work for company in Germany, which are doing insurance on hydropower scheme in New Zealand, if you believe so. But they have access to huge amount of power. They can buy $1 million data set that then after they can go and spend 1 or 2 months on supercomputer data mining. The other thing is, unfortunately, the science is not there. I don't know if you realize, in order to be able to answer a question like Nancy or Belinda want to know, we need to be able to forecast the weather 20, 30 years in advance. Honestly, we can't even forecast the weather a week in advance. I'm talking about weather, and there is a difference between weather and climate. Here we are talking about climate, which is much more the creeping change that you are seeing in the signal, not the huge variation that you have around. Unfortunately, for a number of events like flooding or like insurance, that's the big thing which is important, not how things are creeping up.
I think we have time for one more question.
how does the research and insurance affect public assets rather than just, because you've been talking about private land and private
So
assets.
I only had 5 minutes. So, so we are also looking at the impact of insurance retreat within infrastructure. So what are the decision making, what are the triggers that are likely to result in that? And in that we'll be looking at precipitation. So how precipitation is going to be impacting infrastructure, and the key piece around public infrastructure is that it's not just the insurance of the asset, it's the potential liability on all those houses that sit behind that asset, and whether the insurance company that insures the houses may go after the local government for the failure. And when you build a piece of infrastructure, you build it for maybe 50 to 100 years. Are you going to be able to have insurance in 50 years for that piece of infrastructure and for the liabilities? We're starting, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much to our presenters today. Nancy, did you want to say a few closing words? We also have our VIPs here for the next session, the so what are we going to do about it question, which that particular session I think really touched on. You know, we're starting to realise that a lot of this stuff is happening. It's going to happen with some degree of certainty. So, you know, the tough question, I guess, over to the politicians about, well, you know, now what? So, thank you, Nancy.
Thanks, Kyle, for all your hosting. I just, so I'll just take 2 minutes, John, if he's even here. I'm not sure he is. I just wanted to thank you all for coming and listening to us present what has been a quite a effort. First, I wanted to thank our guests. Thank you, Belinda and Christian and Brandon, for coming and joining us today. Your talks were really insightful and informative, and it's great to hear more from beyond our council walls. I really wanted to thank my CCRA colleagues, all of you. I won't spend the time to name you all. Everyone already knows you. Well, actually, I should, because some people haven't even been able to be here today. So to Jennifer and Mario and Craig and Megan and Melissa, who's in California, and Chad and Kyle and Jamie, who's somewhere in the back, and I hope I didn't miss anyone. And Todd. Sorry, Todd. Todd's here too. Thank you. You all have been great. And I just want everyone to know that we did start this from a cold start, and it needed to be done right away, which was impossible to do. And we all actually, I will say, have more than 100% workloads, and everyone took this project on in addition to their more than full FTE already, with no additional time. We didn't manage to create time in our time-space continuum during the project, and no resources either. So there's been a lot of long hours. To create what you would have seen is actually rather basic, which we will fully admit. The 2019 CCRA from Auckland is just the first chance to try to start bringing some data together, to start thinking about what risk in Auckland might be, or what climate change might mean for all of us. So I appreciate all of your efforts. It's not been easy for a number of reasons. And so I also want to thank our road crew or support crew. There's been a lot of people who've been helping us get here. Everyone from Megan and Jacques and Eva and Regan and Anne and Brenda, and our review managers, Coral and Laura, and everyone else I'm probably forgetting right now. People have stepped up to just try to start creating this information, and it's mattered, and it's great. There have been times when we thought we should probably just go ahead and cancel climate change. But since we can't, I just wanted to say that and it's hard, and there's so many things to say, but probably not to this audience, because actually I know some of you I don't know all, but it feels like a very receptive and friendly crowd, which is quite nice. And there's so many questions that come out of this project, and there is so much more work to do, and that's where REMU is at, is that we know climate change needs to be part of our program, and we would like to take it from here. And we don't know quite what that means right now, and probably have to take a bit of a breather, but certainly all of us are interested in doing more in this area, so please do contact whoever you're interested in, any of us, because there's more to do. And I guess I want to say, since we can't cancel climate change, I think we all need to recognize that it just actually rather, it's the new normal. And we've talked about that quite a bit in the past month as we've been trying to deal with things that have been coming at us. But instead of being scared of it or feeling like it's a risk, what we need to do is normalize it. It just has to become a part of our daily conversations in all respects. So whoever you are, for us, it becomes part of our work as scientists and researchers. For policymakers, it probably has to be quite the common thing that is taken into account, as well as every other thing that's taken into account, because it is here and it isn't going away, and it is important. And it's not necessarily important, well, who it's important for is us. It's a human problem, it's a human cause problem, but it is also the ramifications of it are for us to deal with. So I guess there's probably a million other things I want to say, but I guess I'll just leave it at that, that I hope we continue to go forward, and I do appreciate all your efforts.
Yeah. If anybody wants to follow up with any of the speakers individually, there is a bio sheet at the back, just underneath the camera there. You can also email us up at remu@aucklandcouncil.govt.nz, and the reports that Remu has produced will be on Knowledge Auckland in the next couple of days, hopefully all of them, but definitely some of them. If you search using CCRA as your keyword, you should find those in the next couple of days. The other thing that I wanted to just finish on was a karakia, just to close this off before we get into the panel of High and Mighties. So if you can repeat after me, please. Tuia ti ki beg your pardon. Tuia ki te rangi. Tuia ki te whenua. Tuia ti moana. Thank you. Tuia ti here tangata. I rongo ti pau. I rongo ti ao. Ti he Māori ora. Ka pai, thank you very much, and I'd invite the John to open his proceedings, please. Thank you.
Fantastic. Kia ora koutou, ko John Moro Takaungoa, ko Tako Toranga, he Chief Sustainability Officer Te Kaunihere o Tamaki Makoto, aho. And could I just get the panelists to come up here while we do this quick transition? This is, maybe you can think of this as kind of lightning round, bonus round here. And while they do that, can we give the Remu team another round of applause, because they've done heroic work. I just want to reiterate what Nancy was closing with, saying they've worked tirelessly over the last year to make this happen, and it hasn't been easy. And it is a first for New Zealand, and this is the first time we've done a localized climate change risk assessment anywhere in the country, and so there are a lot of people watching this, so thanks to the team for really pulling it forward. So look, we're going to switch gears just briefly, and I think I recognize the resilience of those in the room for being here for quite some time, going through a fire drill, etc. And we're what keeps you between here and lunch. But we thought it would be quite useful to build on the evidence that has been created and talk a little bit about what's next and the bigger picture, and in fact bring others across the sectors into the conversation. And it was really heartening in the last session to hear a little bit about, well, IAG is doing this, and well, we have IAG with us now. We get right of rebuttal, Bryce. It was good to hear, well, what do we do as decision makers? Well, Penny Hall's here, counselor and committee chair for the Environment Committee, is here to talk about that. And then, David, I have a hard time explaining where you fit in besides the philosophical component, the finance component, the ethical component. There's quite a long laundry list. So I think it might be useful to do a quick intro, each of the panelists introducing their areas of expertise. And then I'll dive in with a couple of quick questions. We'll try to keep it to about 30 minutes, and we'll take some from the floor after I exhaust my very few questions in the korero. So thank you, and why don't we just do a quick little self-introduction around the table.
Kia ora tātou. I'm David Hall. I'm a senior researcher at the Policy Observatory at AUT. Partly why I have such diverse research interests is I started off with geography, which is the classic grab bag topic, which cuts across everywhere, but ended up in political philosophy. So I tend to approach geography topics, including migration policy and climate change, through a sort of theoretical lens. And like Belinda, I found myself moving from the policy side into the finance side. So I'm on the technical working group for the sustainable finance roadmap that's been developed. I work in the innovation space designing climate finance instruments. And I've also been involved with council on developing the urban forest strategy and also the independent advisory group for the climate action plan. So it's enough.
Kia ora, I'm Penny Hulse. I chair the Environment and Community Committee, and I guess I trained at the wonderful Waitakere, the Eco City, together with extraordinary people like Anne McGee, scientists, philosophers, geographers, and people who put together a very early approach about dealing with local government and climate change at a time when people thought we were a bunch of hill tribe hippies. So I just acknowledge some of my fellow ex-Waitakereans who are present. It's a real privilege to be amongst such an extraordinary bunch of people. Thank you.
Hi, and I'm Bryce Davies from IAG. My role at IAG spans a couple of things, broadly in the kind of the reputational sort of space, but I think about public policy, and in that, what's the role of the insurance sector, what's the role that IAG wants to play, and so that sees me talking to government quite a lot. I also look after, I guess, in what we've called sustainability, what we've called shared value, what's corporate responsibility sort of stuff, and a big chunk of that has been around climate change, and we've been thinking about climate change for a couple of decades almost, so it's quite important to us. It goes directly to our P&L, goes directly to our balance sheet, goes directly to the role that we play in society as a business, as an industry. So what's been happening of late is that kind of public policy and that social responsibility piece has been coming together. And so I've sat on the government's technical working group on adaptation that reported a couple of years ago, along with James, I can see in the audience. And I also am involved in the Aotearoa Circle's sustainable finance thing. I'm on the leadership team there. So that's a little bit about me. And I'm happy to answer any insurance questions and lays people's concerns to rest, but we might do that afterwards.
Added bonus here. So I don't have enough time to kind of talk about why this work was commissioned and how it's feeding into the climate action plan that we're developing with many of you and a lot of folks in this building right now. But suffice to say, it's actually crucially important to make sure we understand what the risks are across a myriad of topics so we could inform an action plan. So I guess if I could take the first question to Councillor Hulse and say, ask, what role do local elected officials play in taking the knowledge that we have and really embedding it into what we do next? And what do you need from us to make that happen?
Thanks, John. Probably the most important thing we need are reports like this. I'm sitting listening to some of this with completely mixed emotions. Part of me wants it to be really, really bad so that we create a burning platform so that people are terrified into action. And the other part, to stop people running in the streets in panic. I'm quite relieved that, we do have a kind of an unfolding crisis to deal with. So for politicians, we need a partially burning platform, but we need information that we can absolutely stand firmly on, and I think that's why these reports are so critical. We also need, however, an acknowledgement that council is a bit of a bit player in this. We've got to have partners, the insurance industry, our academics, our academic institutions, business, our community, and all of the other players in this. Because if we're to change the shape of politics and change the shape of decisions that are made, we need our community to be absolutely enrolled in this as a fundamental plank for decision making. Otherwise we'll be stuck in the ridiculous 3-year cycle, which I've mentioned before, of short-term decision making, making it all about finances, and having people standing saying ridiculous things like, vote for me, I will cut red tape. And for that I say, what a load of bollocks, because red tape in the local government terms is, how about we stop you building a house in a floodplain, which is then going to be uninsurable and put your family at risk. We think that's quite sensible. So the very short answer is politicians need pre-digested material. They need material that is absolutely rigorous, that comes from a strong scientific basis, that is interpreted for the community and takes us along a slightly different and more sensible approach than the one that we've been on previously.
Great. If I could pivot to Bryce and say, a lot of this, just the brass tacks, I mean, we're trying to see the future here, but it's been on your minds and it's part of your bottom line, and it has been forever. So how are you on the cutting edge? What are you thinking of next? And what are the real ramifications for decisions about who to insure and where?
Easy then, eh? What are we thinking about? There's a number of things that we're thinking about. Certainly we're thinking about understanding this more. We do employ lots of scientists. We do lots of modelling. We do have a hell of a lot of data that tells us how buildings and businesses perform through floods and storms and all those sorts of things. So we continue to build our knowledge around this for a whole variety of reasons, which I won't get into. But we also know that we've got two roles to play around this. One part of our role is to actually signal risk. So when we start to put our prices up, when we start to add on excesses, when we start to say no to either parts of risks or entirely, that's supposed to be setting a signal. Insurance is the market of pricing risk, so it's a price signal that often gets ignored. So that's an important role we need to play, but we need to balance that role off against the other probably important role we play, which is to be there when people suffer loss, right? We are the mechanism that is supposed to help fund recovery. And so certainly for IAG, what we think about a lot is how do we get that balance right? We've been here since 1859. We've been here a long time. We want to continue being here for a long time. We make money by insuring people, so we want to insure as many people as possible. But we also know we've got a role to play and an influencing role. So the other thing we're thinking about is how do we actually help shift the system through our voice, through our actions, through our investments. I'll leave it there, otherwise I'll go on for hours.
David, over to you, and just thinking about, we've seen some maps and heard a little bit about the disparities of where and who will be impacted by climate change. Any thoughts, maybe with your philosopher's hat on, plus the finance hat on, about the role and the considerations around equity in this issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, the key thing is I just have to thank Remu for the work that's been done on this, because the first step is really understanding those inequities and the distributional aspects of these issues. And I thought the analysis of vulnerability was exceptionally helpful in that regard, identifying some of those potential problems and where some resources might be directed to in a preemptive manner. As we move forward, I think it's just vital to think about the sorts of principles that we involve in our decision-making processes, especially around transitions. This is probably captured best in the idea of the just transition, which has obviously developed a lot of momentum over the last couple of years with the new government. That was language that they have adopted from a long tradition in the labour movement, but it really is being applied much more broadly now, and I think that is absolutely vital to think through. What are some of the forms of compensation that we might need to consider for people who can't necessarily move out and adapt from the changes that are coming. Insurance is not available to everybody, and so what role do public entities have to play in insurance? I know that I'm trying to bring in the voice here of one of my colleagues on the Independent Advisory Group, Judy Lawrence, who's one of the lead authors for the IPCC's upcoming report on the vulnerability chapter for Australasia. And she's done work with Jonathan Boston on thinking about financial mechanisms that might be able to provide some of that support that is otherwise not going to be delivered by the market. But it is really keeping in mind these principles of equity and and care for people and for vulnerable groups, and being aware of the fact that different groups have different abilities to adapt. I could bring in the voice of another of my colleagues on the IAG, Rhys Jones, who's been long warning of the fact that Māori communities are much more vulnerable to these effects, particularly because those communities have a higher proportion in some of those areas which were identified to have, higher vulnerability to the effects and also less adaptive capacity. So it really is just a matter of keeping these issues in mind, keeping in mind the redistributional effects and also recognition of the fact that people have different capacity to adapt.
I guess channeling my inner Judy Lawrence would be, oh, sorry, Penny, do you like to say something?
I think we're both kind of leaping to that. For me, that's probably the most critical part of all of this. If you look at the intersect of all of these extraordinary pieces of work, he tangata, he tangata isn't and shouldn't be said lightly, because it comes right back to how are we actually going to focus our work. We're not going to turn the tide, we're not going to hold the cliffs back, we're not going to stop the ice shelves melting. How is it going to impact our communities? And thinking from the local government perspective, through what lens are we going to make decisions in our long-term plans? And if these lenses are created by these plans that we've seen today, with the absolute focal point being the impact on our most vulnerable communities. And I think that wonderful concept of climate change being a magnifier of social deprivation, it means we will be planting trees in South Auckland to increase the tree cover, because we'll be dealing with shade and carbon sequestration. We will be making opportunities for drinking fountains in parks, because people will be battling, dehydration and heat. We will be looking at healthy homes retrofits that take into consideration climate change resilience. We will be building our communities differently so that it's not left to individuals to try and cope with the impacts of climate change. And ideally, and this is something I'll probably be very unpopular about, I would love to see legislative change in the Local Government Act that requires us to deal with the impacts of climate change mitigation and adaptation in every decision we make, and to consider the impact on our most vulnerable communities. And boy, oh boy, you'd see money travelling in some very different directions and some very different infrastructure decisions being made.
You're not going to get another question, I'm sure of it. Can I just pick up on two things there? I think, yes, there are scientific challenges that we've got to overcome, but I don't think that's the problem here. There are financial issues to overcome, but again, that's not the problem. There are some decisions to be made, some governance challenges here, but again, that's not the problem. At the top of all of that is the moral decision. It is the courage to make the right decisions, to look after people, to look after the long-term prosperity of the city and everyone that's part of it. And fundamentally, this is a problem of morality and ethics. All those other things are just technical issues that we will work our way through. Right? We need to with some urgency, and maybe we don't know how to do that, but at the heart of this is, as you say, it's the people, and it's about how we support this community.
That's a good add. I don't need to offer another question. I would reiterate something that came through quite loudly on day one of the symposium, and that was particularly the youth in intergenerational equity and the Māori rangatahi who were with us in quite force for the first half of the day, and thinking about this as an intergenerational equity issue beyond just who right now is alive and who's actually dealing with the impacts.
So just to pick up on another point there, what Penny was saying, it's great that we've got to this place in this process, right? There was a bunch of things we didn't know, and we did some science to understand them. It's now understanding what does that mean for us. We have a risk assessment, and we will have a plan. But these things should not be standalone, right? They need to be seen as the beginning of a continuous cycle of adaptation. And even if you put that in place, that cannot be seen in isolation, a thing in and of itself. It has to be, as Penny's saying, baked into all decisions. This can't be, oh, we've got our climate change thing on the side here. This is fundamental to every decision that needs to be made. So I would wholeheartedly support that sort of legislative change you're going after. On
the issue of youth and intergenerational, a concept which often comes up, what always comes up in this space is resilience. And I've been helping Judy with the IPCC, just doing some literature reviews, and part of that was going back to some of the literature that's come out of the Christchurch earthquake. I'm a Christchurcher, and you know, we've been asked to be resilient, and we're going to be asked to be resilient again. But there was a lot of frustration around that language at the time, and I think a major problem there was that resilience was often expected of people rather than systems and institutions. And I think that's a vital distinction to make, that expectation of resilience needs to fall on the institutions. And one very clear example which came through from the post-earthquake response was that support services for young people, especially for dealing with mental health and well-being issues, there wasn't the support systems in place. There was an inequity across the generations, and the older generations had better access to support services. And you just wonder, you know, if we don't solve these sorts of inequities in the way that we supply and provide support, even in, you know, areas like mental well-being, you know, how are different generations and different groups going to deal with some of the disruption which is ahead from, you know, increased chances of extreme weather events and so on. And also some of the completely unpredictable economic effects that, you know, may well be coming through, which I'm sure Bryce is very aware of, you know, the sorts of transition risks and liability risks and financial risks that Mark Carney has warned about that will manifest themselves in incredibly unpredictable and probably quite sudden ways in the coming decades, and that could, you know, really quite radically transform the economy and what businesses are viable and so on in quite unpredictable and unexpected ways.
I think now's a perfect point to introduce my inner channeling of Judy Lawrence to say two things. One is that if she were here, I think she would say, well, yeah, the emissions side, that's easy. The adaptation and the resilience side is really the challenge here, and we don't want to pick sides. We're trying to do them both, so that makes it even more difficult. I think the other thing she would say is that resilience is not an endpoint, and we're always on a continuum because things are always changing. So I guess I might want to take a couple questions from the floor and try to wrap up around one. But I just pitch it to the panel and just kind of a general question about, so what next? I heard a call to action from Penny legislatively. I think about who's not around the table, who should be, and how to get them to the table. Maybe some reflections on how do we take this forward together?
Just a very, very small issue for me is how do we make this relevant, understandable, and politically important to all our communities so that this continues to be driven not just by the people who are in this room, and that's our challenge, and that's taking it out to all our communities with the greatest of respect to us. We are still a fairly monocultural audience and a fairly monocultural series of players. That's, I think, our big challenge.
I think one of the key things now is that this provides a really good platform for a whole bunch of conversations that need to be had. The people that aren't in the room need to be brought into the room. There's a whole bunch of connections here. You know, the compounding, the cascading impacts. What is, you know, understanding those and getting all the people who need to be part of this solution about how we adapt into the conversation. So just two small examples. The issue of land use and what we build and where we put it is of fundamental interest to us. But that requires conversations between council, insurers and banks that haven't happened before. Because the system has worked in a way that if the council consented it and it built it, we'd generally insure it and the bank would lend against it. But that way of development in this country will have to change. Right? So consideration of risk has to come up front. Will it be lent against? Will it be insured? So conversations about that and about what is the long-term trajectory for a community around the financial support for it from banking and insurance is one example of a conversation. Completely different one. There's a lot of work in here around disease. Well, conversations between Ministry of Health and district health boards about how do we make sure we've got, for example, enough isolation wards for infectious diseases. How do we make sure that the primary care system and doctors actually understand, how to identify and treat these sorts of diseases? That's a completely different set of conversations. So there's all these overlapping kind of clusters of people that we need to bring together, because there's no way in hell that the council's going to do it by itself, that we're going to do it by itself. We each have a role to play and an influence that we can bring to bear, but we're going to have to all join up on this if it's going to work and be achieved in the timeframes we need it to be achieved.
David, any thoughts? Or should we pitch out to a couple questions?
Yeah, let's spread it.
Yep. So why don't we just take a couple questions from the floor? You've been a nice vocal bunch thus far.
Yeah, just a quick question about the problem of dealing with projections into the future, which keep getting revisited every few years. So some of the data you're using currently seem quite conservative. How does that affect, not necessarily in the insurance industry space, but all of you, in terms of the problem of constantly working with data, which, I mean, the IPCC is a classic, right? So they came out and said, actually, it's 1.5. No debate. What are the implications? Why? Because there's going to be a hell of a lot of problems if we don't keep it to that level. How do you plan for that in a way which makes sense when currently there's not a lot of engagement in the estimates that were made that are 10 years old? And you say you don't want to scare people too much, but part of the problem now is how do you actually put that information out and say this is what we're really dealing with, and it is a bit scary. How are you going to do that as a council?
I'll start. So I think we fundamentally need to be really honest about what the worst case scenario looks like to get people sitting up and taking notice. My experience of putting flooding on the limbs for property owners, we did that in Waitakere. We started back in 2000. I think it didn't create dramas, it didn't create problems, we just did it, and thank God we did. So I think first of all getting the information out there, the worst possible scenario. We do have to also look at and model what the worst case scenario looks like and ideally plan around that. However, we then need to be pragmatic and talk with our community about what we can do in the interim. It'll be ludicrous for us to suddenly demand everyone retreat from audio or whatever. So, point out the worst, plan for the worst, manage the middle ground scenario, but also be really upfront about the fact that information will change. This is not an exact science. Let's trust the scientists, but trust enough to say we also trust the change and we trust the changing information. That's for me, the biggest. We need to get rid of the white coat phobia and start to, as a council, be brave enough to live in the slight realms of not unknowing. What's the point? I'll turn to a philosopher and scientist. There's the realm of uncertainty that you need to live in honestly, and I think it's about time we did that.
Yeah, no, I definitely endorse that message. I mean, your point triggered two thoughts, and one echoes what Penny said, which is that it is important to say the bad story because, I've done a lot of work into decision making, and actually, a sense of anxiety is a great way to force people to cease to be complacent about the status quo and to look at other options. Like that's a sort of behavioural response to a state of anxiety, is to sort of put your head above the parapet and look at what other ways you might do something. So I think, telling only a good story and an optimistic story would avoid that. So I think that's important. And I think, the other aspect is just to acknowledge and recognise the uncertainty and then to work with that. And rather than fix ourselves into permanent solutions that anticipate one set of events, is to really build in a sense of adaptiveness and responsiveness and a capacity for learning from change and from unexpected events. And this is actually where the the literature on and the empirical work on resilience is very useful, and I certainly recommend the Asian Cities Climate Change and Resilience Network. They've been doing a lot of work on this in the Southeast Asian region, where a lot of the cities are incredibly vulnerable to climate change, and I think a lot of that work is miles ahead of anything I've seen here. And you know, there is these virtues of a responsive city, you know, that a city which recognizes itself as an adaptive system, that it has you know, responsiveness to events. It has a capacity to learn from new information and to be open to new information, a capacity to have safe failure, so you know, if something goes wrong in the system, the whole thing doesn't fall over. It can manage little bits of collapse. A capacity for flexibility, so lots of different options and modularity, and also a capacity for redundancy, which is a strange engineering term, which means, you know, having more capacity than you need, so that if one part of the transport network, say, becomes unusable, say, you know, an oil price spike and people can't afford to get in their cars anymore, you've got enough capacity in other transport mechanisms to manage the people who need to get around but who can't afford to get in their cars. So it's building in that, you know, working with the complexity, working with the uncertainty, rather than trying to pave it over with you know, fixed infrastructure and fixed solutions.
Endorse all of that. You know, I think the answer to your question has been mentioned by these two in answers to previous questions. We need to reduce, it's like that old song, you know, got to party like it's 1999, right? We've got to reduce like it's 1.5, and we've got to adapt like it's 3.0, right? Because it ain't going to be 1.5. But we've got to try as hard as we can to get there. It's going to be 3 degrees, right? We've not even been on that 1.5 pathway that I can tell. So we need to keep that in mind. But there's always going to be uncertainty. But I think the really important thing is that if you, irrespective of what the numbers are, if there's in kind of a bit of insurance language here, if there's a really clear appetite for the risks that you're taking on, and that's about the principles by which we're going to make decisions, and how much of this thing we want to take on and live with, and how much we expect people to take on for themselves, how much we're going to help, that guides the decision. And so it doesn't really matter what the science is, it doesn't really matter where the water is, where the floodplains are, where the winds are. We've got a set of criteria to answer those questions about what we do next. So that's really important. But you only get that, to Penny's point, if you've got the community with you. So they have to buy into how we're going to make decisions around this. You know, is it okay for the lounge rooms to have water 30 centimetres under the floorboards? Is that okay? Probably not, because that's a damp house. That's not a healthy home to be living in. So those sorts of really practical trigger points and decisions are really important to land, because they will guide all the decisions that need to come.
So I'm sure we can keep going. I want to respect your time. Maybe I like the final takeaway point being, you know, let's reduce like it's 1.5 and adapt like it's 3.0. That's fantastic. And I also want to really acknowledge each of these three champions in the work that they do for climate change and getting Auckland to a better place. They've done tremendous work up to this point and will continue to do so, thank goodness. And also to the folks in the room. I mean, a lot of you have done the work yourselves. A lot of you are the researchers who have done the work or have worked with us and will continue to do so. So we need to build our whānau out here and really think about how we tackle these challenges over the next several decades together. So with that, thanks for coming. We'll close there.